contributed mightily to the destruction of Syria. I don't know if your listeners are aware of it, but the CIA, working very closely with the Mossad as well as MI6 from London, worked tirelessly to destroy Syria, destroy its national integrity, destroy it as a state. It took them a little over 15 years, but it worked. Now they've got what they think they want. The problem, of course, is the people in charge, this Mr. Jolani and his friends, have a terrible track record. And they've already begun committing atrocities against various minorities in that country. Armenians, Christians of all types and kinds, Alawites, Shia. And not that this is anything surprising, but what is a little alarming is the lack of coverage in the United States of that sort of thing. So instead, they see a portrait of Mr. Trump walking arm in arm with Mr. Jolani, telling everyone that this is a fine young man with lots of potential and that he's very pleased to meet him. When, from the vantage point of most of us who know something about the region, he's simply a war criminal who's continuing to murder people that don't deserve to be murdered. Not that anybody does. Now, you were talking about this competition, though, on infrastructure side. First of all, the route that reaches from the Indian Ocean up through Iran, across the Caucasus into Russia, that is going to be fiercely defended by the Russians and the Iranians. It's real. It's going to become more real in the future. I'm sure your listeners are aware that one of the first trains have already arrived in Iran from China. So the rail connection there is very important. And that rail connection will be expanded and reach all the way to the Indian Ocean. That connection is important for India because, remember, India lives next door to Pakistan, not exactly the most stable place in the world. And the ability to ship through that new approach from southern Iran up into Russia, from Russia then into into Europe, is very important. The other routes that you mentioned that are very important to the Turks. The Turks are big on the lateral axis. Mr. Erdogan is already wandering around in the dark telling people, oh, the Turkic Empire. The Turkic Empire is inevitable now. We're going to have this access. It runs through Turkey up to Azerbaijan, and then through Azerbaijan out to all of the Turkic states in Central Asia. Well, it sounds like a great idea. The problem is that he doesn't necessarily have the support for what he wants to do in Central Asia. And we know from past experience that every time a Turk has tried to march east through the Caucasus to try and stir up support for this Turkic empire, it's failed. The last man who tried it with hundreds of thousands of Turkish troops was Enver Pasha. And he was shocked and disappointed when he discovered that the Muslim Turkic peoples of the Caucasus and Central Asia were actually quite content to live with the Tsar and were absolutely disinterested in rising up against the Tsar on his behalf. I have a feeling that you've got something similar happening there today. If you go to Central Asia, most of the Central Asians that I have worked with and talked to are very comfortable with Mr. Putin. He is viewed as a source of stability and support for them. Whenever an Uzbek or a Tajik or any of the various people that govern in that part of the world is in trouble, he has shown up quickly and supported them, helped them restore order. And they're very comfortable with the Russians as a security guarantee of some kind against the Chinese, because the Chinese in that part of the world are extremely unpopular. China knows this. So if China is going to build its one belt, one road through Central Asia, it's absolutely dependent upon Moscow. So it's an interesting set of dynamics. We are very involved in this thing because of Israel. And I think your listeners need to understand that if it were not for Israel, we probably would not be involved at all. I mean, quite frankly, we are not dependent upon the oil and gas that comes out of the Persian Gulf anymore. And that's not just because we have a surplus of our own. It's simply that the principal consumer is China, along with Japan and Korea and others in Northeast Asia. So I think the problem for us is which way do we move? Whom do we support? Well, that answer is provided to us by Israel, because the Israeli lobby in Washington is the all-powerful influence when it comes to any question that's raised in the region. So if people are asking, what are we going to do? Where are we going to go? Whom are we going to support? The answer to that is very easy. We're going to support whomever Mr. Netanyahu tells us to.
Thank you, Colonel, for that very insightful analysis. If we could, I love how you provided a much bigger picture for our audience to get better understanding of what's happening in the area. It's not just something localized. Um, my question is going back to Syria. Do you see, because in Syria it's not just these two, it's the peace line of Israel and the development road of Turkey. There's also the another map from, if we could put it up, it's the David's corridor. And would that, do you think, okay, so I'd like you to explain to our viewers about Israel pushing even further through other plans like these, which is the David Corridor for our viewers. It's aimed at covering a land route from the Golan through the Druze-held Suwaida area in the south, all the way up to the Kurdish-controlled areas in northeast Syria, which you mentioned, near the American Al-Danf base. Do you think that could probably bring Israel and Turkey on a face-to-face collision course?
Yes, I do, although it's not immediate. Remember that from the standpoint of Israel, the route that you're presenting really runs through the Kurdish population. The Kurds are a useful battering ram for use against Iran. Now, the Kurds also have their problems with the Turks. And the difficulty for the Israelis is, on the one hand, they want the Kurds to attack Iran. They want the MEK to continue to be a terrorist force on their behalf against the Iranians. On the other hand, they probably are not sure quite yet what they want them to do vis-a-vis Turkey. Much of that depends on Mr. Erdogan. He's got a lot of forces. I'm talking about Mr. Erdogan, and he could move into that area and do a lot of damage very quickly. I don't think the Israelis want that to happen. Obviously, the route that you're depicting is important to them. I mean, throughout this entire war that's been going on since this thing got started in 2023, oil and gas and food have come to Israel from Turkey. Without the Turkish support, the Israelis would be in a lot of trouble. So I think they're going to tread carefully. So I don't think we can point to a sort of permanent solution yet. You've raised the right issue. You've put it on the map. You've shown it. That's a bigger issue. Now, there's also another corridor. This is the corridor in southern Armenia that borders Iran, that connects Azerbaijan with Turkey. That's extremely important because that's the centerpiece of Mr. Erdogan's greater Turkish integration, if you will. I don't know how that's going to turn out. It looks like the current Armenian president has decided to defer to us. We're urging him to essentially go along with what these Turkish states want. I don't think that suits the Russians, who are very uncomfortable with that. But that corridor is very, very important to Erdogan. And without that corridor, it's difficult for the two Turkish states to support each other. So before we see Mr. Erdogan engage in any direct conflict over the corridor that you showed, he's got to get control of the first one up in the Caucasus.
Exactly.
They need to be able to coordinate. And of course, the ultimate goal is to march into northern Iran, because in the midst of all of this, Mr. Erdogan and Mr. Aliyev would both like to acquire or annex northwestern Iran, with Tabriz at the center. So I guess, to quote someone from a movie, we have plans inside plans inside plans. But we don't necessarily have the resources where they need to be to realize them all. And they can't be addressed simultaneously.
Yeah.
So Erdogan has to say, well, how much can I do in southern Syria? You know, I've also got the agenda in with Azerbaijan. I have the agenda with the Kurds. I can't take on everything at once. And I don't really want to take on Israel at this point, not because of Israel so much, but because of the United States. So these are hard questions for him to answer. I hope they remain hard for him, because otherwise it's not going to be good for the region,
No.
in my view.
No, sir. Colonel, since you touched upon Iran, so yesterday, July 22nd, President Trump threatened to launch a new attack on Iran's nuclear facilities, just hours after Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi told Fox News that Tehran will not abandon its enrichment program and called on Washington to agree to a fair deal that includes lifting of sanctions. So you've warned that a single strike could ignite World War III. And during the 12-day war, we narrowly avoided it. In your view, Colonel, is the Trump camp misreading Iran's actions during that 12-day war? And are they also now misreading Iran's global red lines today?
First of all, I think another resumption of conflict, in other words, another extension of the war between Israel, the United States, and Iran, is probably inevitable.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not I'm not sure what the trigger will be or the catalyst, but I think it's hard to avoid. The problem that President Trump has is a problem that more than one U.S. president has faced over many decades. You make a strident remark, a comment that commits you to action, and then later on you want to retreat from that policy position. You find it's very, very difficult to do so. My own experience with Mr. Trump is that this is not someone who wants a war with anybody. Unfortunately, he both talks his way into it and he supports others like Israel on the way into it. So I think we're going to see a resumption of conflict with Iran. Now, the Iranians, in the meantime, have not committed under any circumstances to the production of a nuclear weapon. Remember, this enrichment was always about civil use and civil application. The Israeli influence in Washington, the Israeli control of our Congress, the Israeli influence in our media convinces everyone on any given day that anything the Iranians say must be wrong. In other words, that the Iranians are always lying. The Israelis are always telling the truth. It's sort of an interesting dynamic, and there are millions of Americans who are fed this sort of thing on a daily basis. So when you say, "Oh, wait a minute, we could come to an arrangement. I mean, this is just civil use. Why are we pressing for complete abolition of any enrichment whatsoever in Iran?" And the answer is, well, you can't trust those Iranians. You know, this will just get worse. We have to strike them. They're the number one terrorist in the world. Well, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. And let's be frank, most of the people I don't think view Iran as a terrorist state at all. This is an old mantra that's been with us since, well, for 46 years. The Iranians have directed most of their activity against anyone who was threatening their co-religionists. In other words, if you're attacking Shiites in Lebanon, Shiites in the Emirates, Shiites in Yemen, well, yes, the Iranians will eventually try to help their co-religionists. Although whenever they've done so, they've tried to do so without necessarily being dragged into direct conflict themselves. Well, now they have no choice. They're in direct confrontation with Israel. That means ultimately with us. Iran was far, far more powerful than the Israelis initially thought when this war began, this 12-day conflict. I think the Israelis grossly underestimated them. I think Ben-Gvir made that comment. Other Israelis, retired officers, have made that comment. So I think the Israelis know they're much more powerful than they thought. Secondly, the Israeli economy is actually in worse shape right now than the Turkish economy. They're in no better shape than Mr. Erdogan's Turkish economy. The difference, of course, is we subsidize them.
Yeah.
And so as long as we can subsidize them and keep them going, there's no incentive for them to change direction whatsoever. Finally, the Iranians now have spent a lot of time rebuilding their integrated air defenses, and this time the Russians are there in strength helping them do it. The Chinese are providing a lot of technical expertise and support in terms of logistics, supply, aircraft. So if this resumes, Iran is going to be in a much stronger position to fight than it was the last time around. Now, you said, then we go to World War III. Well, that depends. First of all, the United States frequently engages first without thinking. In other words, we have this expression, ready, aim, shoot. Well, we often say ready, shoot, aim. We screw it up. There's a lot of bad thinking going on in the senior levels in military thinking about what we can or can't do, what we should or should not do. the possibility that you can involve yourself in a war that lasts longer than a few days or a few weeks is something that I don't think anyone is considering. The possibility that your initial conventional confrontation in the future would fail badly and that the pressure on the United States to turn to a tactical nuclear weapon in order to save face and not look like a loser is going to be tremendous. I think there are some people that understand that, but the majority of people in Washington are stuck in a time warp. They think it's 1991. In other words, they don't see how profoundly the region has changed. They assume that everything they see today will be there next year. That includes the ruling elites in the Arab world. I don't think people understand that the ruling elites in the Arabian Peninsula are actually on very fragile ground. What they want to do, which is usually enrich themselves regardless of the circumstances, and what their populations want are not the same. You have a similar situation in Egypt. You have General Sisi, who is desperate to hold the country together. He knows how fragile it is, but he could also be lost overnight by an angry population that sees him as an Israeli or an American puppet. In other words, the region is not stable at all. And this war has made it that much more unstable. Now, you have an interesting situation on Cyprus. And the reason I bring that up is that Mr. Erdogan warned early on that if the Israelis or their allies utilized the air facilities, in other words, the airfields on Cyprus, that he reserved the right to attack Cyprus. I don't think there's an appreciation for how rapidly this could spread. And the situation between Greece and Turkey, obviously, is not exactly great. So the war in the Middle East has the potential to explode in a number of different directions with uncertain consequences. I don't think we in the United States really understand that.
Exactly, sir. Sir, I would like us, even though it's a hot topic recently and discussed around, I'd like us to touch on, because you've mentioned it quite often in your responses right now, on like the capture of the U through lobby in DC, who's really in control. So you've warned that the US is being dragged into wars by design, not by accident. And that quote you said is the Israeli lobby shapes US foreign policy more than voters ever will. We now have US officials openly declaring loyalty first to a foreign state, like Senator Ted Cruz shockingly did on Tucker Carlson a month ago. We also saw it a little while back, recently actually, with New York mayoral candidates when they were asked during a televised debate prior to the New York mayoral election to pledge visits to Israel. I don't know if you saw that clips, sir. We also see it with Christian Zionists who are no longer on the fringe, but they are now in key roles like Secretary of Defense Hegseth and Mike Huckabee, who's the U.S. ambassador to Israel. And meanwhile, AIPAC, the foreign lobby, is not registered under FARA and is flooding American elections with millions to unseat any candidate who won't toe the Zionist line. It doesn't stop with elected officials, sir. Former CIA executive assistant to the deputy director turned whistleblower John Kiriakou was on my show a few weeks ago, and he spoke powerfully about the rising number of Israeli-linked appointments inside U.S. national security agencies. So, Colonel, a two-part question. Do most Americans truly grasp how deeply AIPAC shapes U.S. foreign policy? And B, has U.S. intelligence been structurally captured to the point that even its core doctrine is no longer fully its own?
Well, the answer to the first question is most Americans do not understand it. Most American citizens do not pay attention to what happens beyond their borders. I know that comes as a shock, but it's true. I once had a Spanish general staff officer who worked with me at Supreme Headquarters, Allied Powers Europe in Mons, Belgium, and I asked him what he thought about America. He had been there. He said, "Well, America is not a country or a nation; it's a planet." In other words, we're not on the planet with everyone else.
Yeah.
I think he's right. And this is hard for people to understand, but remember, one of the beauties of the United States is that from the Atlantic to the Pacific, you've got one language, or have historically. And you have a body of law there that is largely enforced. It has been wonderful for trade. It's been great for domestic development. And we grew rich really between 1870 and 1950. That's the big period of expansion and growth in the United States. It's not that what happened before was not important. I'm just saying that's when everything explodes. You get the giant scientific industrial base that we have or had. And then these wars enriched us because we were never touched by them. And that's something else. The last time we were actively touched by war was the Civil War between 1861 and 65. So the interesting thing is that you travel around the United States and you'll see all these placards that go back to the Civil War. You have battlefields that are preserved, vast cemeteries filled with the people that died, almost 1 million men in the Civil War. Now, you have other monuments and things to the various wars, but nothing on the scale of the Civil War. My point is this, that if you live in a country that is invulnerable to external threats for all intents and purposes, you don't need to know a lot about the rest of the world. You don't need higher education, to be blunt, in order to make a lot of money. I mean, I've talked to people, in an area like Missouri, outside of Kansas City. These people were multimillionaires, and they knew nothing about the world beyond Missouri, nothing, and could care less. Now, they were very patriotic. So if you ask them, well, should we bomb so-and-so? Their view is, well, if they're bad, we should bomb them. Without knowing what the hell they're talking about, right? Because we're patriotic Americans. But, you can own a string of dry cleaners at a gas station and become a multimillionaire. This is a wonderful country in many respects, but it does not promote understanding. It does not enhance cultural awareness of anything, because you live on a planet. Now, having said all of that, what happens in Washington? Well, you have this entity called the American Israeli Political Action Committee. Earlier, it was called something else, but it's the same entity that was founded after in 1951 or 52. It's effectively a foreign lobby, but because the money for this lobby comes from within the United States, it is treated as a domestic entity. Now, President John F. Kennedy, who was killed in October, November 1963, as you know, he set out to change that because he saw the tremendous influence that it was exerting on the Hill. And how does the lobby exert influence? Very simply, if you want to support whatever the lobby wants, they will give you lots of money for your reelection. They will open doors for you, access to financial firms in New York City. They will provide you with the wherewithal to enrich yourself. Somebody said, why does Chuck Schumer, Senator Schumer from New York City, always refer to these bad billionaires that have so much influence? Why doesn't he mention the multitude of 100 millionaires and millionaires? Well, that's because everybody in Congress is a millionaire. Well, how did they become millionaires? They weren't millionaires when they arrived. Well, the lobbies in general, the defense lobby, the pharmaceutical lobby, the Israeli lobby, they are in a position to enrich people, to provide them with stock tips, to steer them in the direction of firms that will help them. So when you watch Mr. Netanyahu come to the United States, he's interrupted 5 times by standing ovations.
Yeah.
Is that because everyone in the Congress is Jewish? Of course not. Do they all love Jews? Do they all want to learn to speak Hebrew? Do they all want a vacation in Israel? No. But they have enriched themselves to a large extent thanks to the American Israeli Political Action Committee. That's all. Now, how do you fight that? How do you get through it? Well, Kennedy tried to. He was killed, obviously, not necessarily for that reason, but it didn't work. His successor, Johnson, was partly Jewish. He had no interest in even touching that. By the time Nixon shows up, Nixon said, well, that's a fact of life.
Yeah.
That's not going to change. They've amassed so much money now that any question arises of importance to the Jewish community, we have to take that into account. And he said after he'd left the presidency, we will always come to Israel's aid. Now, he dressed it up in very nice language, talked about these wonderful, talented people and how much we love it and so forth. But the bottom line is they are a true political power. So the people that you're referring to, I think it was Bongino in the FBI, Kash Patel in the Department of Justice, Tammy Bruce, the spokeswoman for the State Department. They're not the only ones. Bondi, who's the Attorney General, they've all more or less said the same thing. Israel is our top priority. Israel is our number one priority. If I took you back to the 50s and 60s and even the early 70s, when I grew up, if someone in the government had said such a thing, a federal marshal would have shown up, arrested them, and they would have then had to go before a grand jury. They could have been indicted for treason. Today, no one says anything. Now, why is that? And you have members that have actually served in the Israeli armed forces. I don't think they've seen any action, but they've shown up and they put on the uniform. Large numbers of journalists, in fact, in the Jewish community, large numbers of people never served in the United States armed forces. There are some who have, but very few, but large numbers who served in the Israeli Defense Forces. It used to be on the books a law that said if you voted in the election of a foreign country or you served in the armed forces of a foreign country, your citizenship was forfeit. You were stripped of American citizenship. All of that's gone away. This is a comment not so much on Israel and the power of money, it's a comment on us.
Yeah.
We've allowed this to happen to ourselves. It's a tragedy, but it influences everything we do. Now, the next question that is usually comes up is, well, there, Douglas, when's this going to change? And I think it changes when we sustain a serious strategic setback, when something bad happens that cannot be concealed from the American public.
Yeah.
Now, when the Vietnam War ended, we stopped talking about it. There was no mention of it. It vanished overnight from the press. Everybody felt strongly that had been a terrible mistake. Nobody wanted to talk about it. Everybody was angry over it. And everybody said, no more Vietnams. So the next time you get a large-scale, serious military action after 1973, 74, which is the time when we had left Vietnam, all the military personnel, is 1990 and 91. Unless you suffer a real strategic setback that involves the loss of American life and is an unambiguous defeat, nothing will change. It will go on and on and on.
Colonel, continuing on that, it's the final question for the interview. For decades, Netanyahu and the Zionist ideologues around him have pushed Washington into war after war in the Middle East, insisting that if America just toppled the 7 regimes that he kept always on putting on repeat, peace will prevail. We're now at the 7th, Iran. Those of us in the region have been warning about this pattern for years, but were smeared and silenced as anti-Semites. And yet, as Professor Jeffrey Sachs said in his interview with me a couple of months ago, the peoples of the region are the true Semites. It's the Zionists, he explained, who have hijacked the term to apply only to Jews, weaponizing it to silence dissent from fellow Semites of the region. Now, even inside the U.S., Trump's MAGA base is waking up. As we've seen Tucker Carlson, Steve Bannon, Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene, they're all calling out what they see, as you said, an Israel first agenda, not an America first, the America first promise that Trump has made. And even recently, Netanyahu, he has visited Washington, I think it's the 3rd time in 6 months. And on his last trip, it was, I think, 5 days long. And he had back-to-back meetings on the Capitol Hill, State Department, the White House, and who knows where else. So U.S. taxpayer-funded officials are not putting America first. We all know that. They're doing Israel's bidding. But Kano, you've said that the U.S. is pretending now to still be in control. Is a facade. How much agency does Washington really, really have left? And is the American public awakening, especially from the MAGA base, we're seeing too late to stop the snowballing of the developments? You said there should be an event that should shock, but isn't it too late?
Well, let me give you an example of how profoundly things have changed over the years. During the Versailles Peace Conference in 1919,
Yes.
a group of Syrians, leaders from Syria, met with President Wilson. And they said, President Wilson, we don't want the French or the British to rule us. Would you send a force and help administer Syria? And Wilson said, well, that's out of the question. The American people would never support that. Well, he was right.
Yeah.
Because the average American at that point said, what are we doing in Syria? You have no business being there. And after the war was over, most Americans concluded we'd fought in the wrong war for the wrong people against the wrong enemy. And by 1950, people were concluding something similar about the Second World War. What I'm trying to tell you is that in those times, we had a strong sense of who we were, what we believed in, what we thought was right or wrong. That has now been distorted dramatically. So Americans now think it's normal and natural for us to involve ourselves in the affairs of other people. This is what I call the bombs away club. Oh, we're bombing Slovenia. Well, that's great. Slovakians, they must be bad. This kind of nonsense. It's horrible, but that's where it is. People don't understand the implications of their actions. Yes, there are people, not just in MAGA, but I would argue on the other side, on the left, who are reaching similar conclusions, who are not comfortable with this. But they're not well organized. They're not well funded. And if you're not well organized and you're not well funded, you are irrelevant in politics. So unless you can line up some billionaires who are willing to put their money behind you, not much is going to change. And this is the largest problem for Americans right now. They're realizing this thing they call democracy in the context of our republic is a fraud. It's not real. You have a small number of people with a lot of money who are determining the course this nation takes. Now, we've had this before, off and on. The difference was that the billionaires back in the early 1900s, late 19th century, people like Andrew Carnegie or J.D. Rockefeller, they were Americans first. The billionaires we're dealing with are not. These are people, frankly, without roots. They are part of this international class called Davos men by Sam Huntington, a professor at Harvard. In other words, people that they live beyond us, remote from us. And that's why I wrote a piece recently called Versailles on the Potomac. And it was directed at President Trump and his government and the people in it, trying to tell them that if you persist in behaving as though everyone is irrelevant except you, if all you do is listen to your donor or donors and ignore the American population, if you live remote from us, not just in thinking, but also geographically, you will not last. You will be removed. But the problem is that right now it looks grim. It looks as though, well, nothing is going to change in the near term. But we have financial problems, and we could spend hours talking about our financial system. It's very fragile. And people say we could go into a depression, and everybody forgets that when we went into a depression the last time, we had the largest manufacturing base in the world. We had the largest skilled labor force in the world. We do not possess either anymore. So if we do, in fact, slide into this economic depression, we're not likely to come out of that quickly. So my point is, the only way things will change, you're talking about a giant battleship the size of the Titanic at sea. You've got somebody leaning on the rudder. That somebody is the lobby and other lobbies, and they're pushing in the direction they want to go. You have people standing on the bridge and say, "Oh, isn't this wonderful?" "Well, sir, we're taking on water." "Well, it's still a great ship." "Well, sir,
thay outfit bà rồi tôi nốt bức tranh này. Yay. Tôi đã hoàn thành bức tranh hoa. Thì bây giờ mình sẽ đối phần nhị hoa màu vàng và mình sẽ hoàn thành bức tranh này. Và chúng ta đã hoàn thành hai bức tranh hoa viên hoa cúc và hoa mẫu đơn. Và đấy là xong. Đây là bức tranh thú lợn và lợn con. Mình sang một tờ tranh nữa. Thì bây giờ mình sẽ tô hình cha con nhà dê nha. Mẹ con này có mi dài lắm. Con dê có màu trắng màu đen, nhưng mà con dê này màu lon. Chắc là mình sẽ cho nó màu, con này màu nâu, con này màu hồng đi, mình thích màu hồng. Cái sừng của nó đậm hồng về luôn. Xong hai cái tai mình sẽ cho cái bên đen xong